Imagine stepping into a royal palace in the Middle Ages. Gold glitters from every corner, servants bow low at your feet, and the air smells of incense and power. To an outsider, it's the picture of elegance and grandeur. But behind those gilded doors, away from the courtly music and the polite smiles, lay secrets so depraved, so scandalous that generations of historians either buried them or softened them beyond recognition. This is not the sanitized version of history you read in school. This is the raw, unfiltered reality of medieval royalty, where lust was a political weapon, pleasure was entwined with cruelty, and the powerful indulged in practices so disturbing they almost vanished from the record. Before we dive into these disturbing tales, a quick reminder: if you enjoy uncovering the dark, hidden side of history, make sure to subscribe and like this video. It helps us keep unearthing the stories they never wanted you to know. Now, let's begin our descent into the royal bedchambers of the Middle Ages. Our first stop is England, a kingdom that loved to paint itself as the pinnacle of chivalry and virtue. But medieval English royalty often played by very different rules. Marriage was rarely about love, it was about power, land, and heirs. Once the ceremony was over, kings were free to indulge in private passions that would shock their subjects if ever revealed. Court gossip in the 14th century whispered about a particular monarch, whose tastes leaned toward elaborate roleplay involving servants dressed as wild animals. It was not uncommon for a banquet to be followed by performances in which these costumed attendants were ordered into intimate acts with the ruler and his chosen partners. While official chronicles left such details out, private letters and coded diary entries suggest that these were not rare occurrences. They were part of a pattern of decadent entertainment in the royal household. The darker side of royal sexuality often merged with humiliation and control. Many kings and queens viewed intimacy not just as pleasure, but as a form of dominance. In some cases, high-ranking courtiers or even visiting nobles were coerced into participating as a way to display their submission. Refusing was dangerous, careers could be ruined, estates confiscated, or worse. In this way, the royal bed became an extension of the throne, a place to demonstrate absolute power. Across the Channel in France, the medieval court was famous for its romances, its poetry, and its art. But the palaces of certain French monarchs hid fetishes far less poetic. A particularly infamous king of the late Middle Ages was rumored to hold what can only be described as private tournaments, competitions among lovers and mistresses, where points were awarded for performance, creativity, and endurance. The prizes were lavish: estates, jewels, titles. But there was a darker edge to it. Participation was rarely voluntary. Women of the court, some barely into their teens, were chosen as contestants, whether they wished to be or not. Chroniclers hint at suicides and early deaths linked to these events, though official records remain silent. And then there's the medieval obsession with purity, an idea twisted into strange and disturbing rituals. In certain royal households, young women were subjected to invasive tests before being deemed fit to marry into the family. These so-called examinations, carried out by trusted female attendants or even physicians, were humiliating, painful, and entirely about preserving the image of dynastic honor. Worse still, some rulers were known to personally oversee such tests under the pretense of safeguarding the bloodline. It was exploitation masked as morality, but it wasn't always the kings. Queens, too, wielded their position to satisfy personal desires. In one notorious case from Eastern Europe, a powerful queen consort kept a secret network of lovers, selected from among the most handsome soldiers of the royal guard. The arrangement was an open secret within the palace, but it had strict rules. Any guard who caught her attention was promoted, lavished with gifts, and after a period of time, quietly reassigned to a distant post or sent on a military expedition they were not expected to return from. It was as if her lovers had expiration dates, and no one dared confront her about it. Moving eastward into the Byzantine Empire, we find perhaps the most theatrical and disturbing courtly pleasures. Some emperors staged entire nights of entertainment, blending religious ceremony with erotic spectacle, using church choirs, incense, and sacred imagery in ways that would be considered outright blasphemy. These were not just private indulgences. They were statements of power over both body and soul, a reminder that the emperor's will was above even divine law. In many cases, the most shocking acts were not recorded directly. Instead, they survive in whispers, in marginal notes scrawled in manuscripts, in hostile chronicles written by political rivals, or in the coded language of poetry and satire. Historians today are left piecing together fragments, reading between the lines to uncover what polite society tried so hard to erase. What becomes clear, though, is that medieval royalty often lived in a world without the moral constraints they demanded of their subjects. Their bodies, their beds, and their power were all tangled in a knot of lust, politics, and cruelty. It is tempting to dismiss these tales as exaggerations by enemies, but too many independent sources, scattered across time and geography, tell strikingly similar stories. And as we dig deeper, you'll see just how far some rulers went, from forcing marriages between children barely out of infancy, to using intimacy as a tool for political blackmail, to indulging in acts so taboo they still carry a chill across the centuries. The idea that royalty was bound by religious or moral rules is one of the most persistent myths in history. In reality, many medieval rulers used religion itself as a prop to heighten their indulgences. In certain royal courts, particularly in Italy and the Iberian Peninsula, sacred relics were incorporated into intimate encounters, not out of piety, but as a display of blasphemous dominance over the very symbols their subjects revered. Some rulers believed this proved they were chosen by God, untouchable by earthly judgment, even while committing acts the church would deem mortal sins. One chilling example comes from the 13th century Aragonese court, where a king was rumored to host midnight blessings for his lovers. These ceremonies involved dressing in priestly robes, reciting altered prayers, and using communion wine in ways far removed from the Mass. Servants who witnessed these acts often disappeared soon after, their silence ensured by fear or by force. Across Northern Europe, certain royal marriages served as nothing more than a veil for deeper, more perverse arrangements. Political unions were brokered with one goal in mind, securing heirs, and once that was accomplished, both parties were free to indulge elsewhere. However, for some monarchs, these elsewhere indulgences became grand spectacles. In the Danish court of the 15th century, the king was infamous for arranging what modern historians could only describe as living art displays, lavishly staged scenes in which nude courtiers and servants posed for hours, enacting erotic tableaux inspired by myth and legend. Guests were invited to walk among them, to comment, to participate. These events blurred the line between theater and exploitation, between consent and coercion. Even more disturbing were the instances where young royals were raised in environments that normalized these extremes from childhood. In certain courts, princes and princesses were exposed to open sexual activity as part of their education. This was justified as preparation for marriage and ruling, but in truth, it often served to desensitize them and bind them into the same cycle of excess as their parents. Chroniclers hint at rooms within palaces set aside for these lessons, decorated with tapestries depicting explicit scenes, some imported from as far away as the Middle East. Meanwhile, in the courts of Central Europe, a fascination with exotic pleasures led to the procurement of lovers from far-off lands, not just for companionship, but as living symbols of the ruler's global reach. These individuals were often stripped of their cultural identity, dressed in costumes chosen for the king's or queen's amusement and paraded at feasts. Behind closed doors, their lives were often a series of humiliations, their status in the palace entirely dependent on the ruler's whim. Perhaps the most notorious yet rarely spoken of practice was the use of intimacy as a political trap. Kings and queens would deliberately seduce high-ranking nobles, foreign dignitaries, or even members of the clergy, only to record or publicly expose the encounter later. In this way, they secured blackmail material that could influence policy, sway treaties, or destroy rivals. A 14th century queen of the German states was said to have orchestrated an entire network of spies, whose sole purpose was to arrange such entanglements, making her one of the most politically powerful and feared women of her time. The danger of these royal appetites was that no one could refuse. Servants, courtiers, and even visiting monarchs understood that the slightest hesitation could be seen as an insult. and an insult to the crown was a death sentence. In this world, desire and terror walked hand in hand, and the royal bedchamber was as much a weapon as the crown itself. By the late Middle Ages, royal courts had perfected the art of disguising debauchery under the cloak of ceremony. Publicly, these rulers attended mass, commissioned cathedrals, and made grand donations to monasteries. Privately, they maintained hidden chambers, suites of rooms deep within the palace that only a select few were allowed to enter. These chambers were often soundproofed with thick draperies and decorated with exotic imports, silk from China, carved ivory screens from Africa, and rare wood scented with incense from Arabia. Inside, the atmosphere was one of intoxicating excess. Perfumed oil lamps cast a dim, golden light that made the skin glow unnaturally, while musicians played softly from behind lattice screens. This was not intimacy in any ordinary sense. It was a performance, a ritualized display of power and pleasure, where the monarch controlled every detail. One of the most infamous examples comes from the Burgundian court of the 15th century. The Duke, known for his charm and diplomatic skill, was equally famous in private for hosting elaborate night banquets. Guests were summoned with personal invitations sealed with gold wax. Upon arrival, they were required to surrender any weapons or religious talismans, a symbolic stripping of protection. The feasts began with rich food and rare wines, but by the third course, the entertainment would turn from music and poetry to acts that pushed well beyond the boundaries of moral law. Some participants attended willingly, drawn by ambition or curiosity. Others found themselves there because refusal meant social ruin or worse. In the French court, certain kings preferred something even darker, the use of humiliation as a form of entertainment. This could mean forcing high-ranking nobles to perform degrading acts in front of other courtiers, or dressing captives in absurd costumes for the ruler's amusement. Sexual dominance was not only a private indulgence, it became a tool to remind everyone of their place in the hierarchy. Royal mistresses and lovers were, of course, common throughout medieval Europe, but the role came with hidden dangers. A favored lover could enjoy immense influence, access to the monarch's ear, lavish gifts, estates, even titles. But just as quickly they could fall from grace. A single act of disobedience or perceived betrayal could lead to exile, imprisonment, or a disappearance explained away as an accident. Chronicles from the 14th century English court tell of a mistress who, after spurning the king's demand for a public display of affection, was found drowned in the moat the next morning. Her death ruled a tragic misstep. Perhaps the most chilling practice, however, was the exploitation of religious vows as a pretext for intimacy. Some rulers would command that certain young women or men enter convents or monasteries, not to live lives of piety, but to ensure their availability in secret. These cloistered servants were hidden away from the public eye, their existence known only to a few trusted members of the court. For the ruler, they were living treasures to be summoned at will. For the victims, it was a life of isolation, fear, and absolute dependence on the whims of their captor. Even marriage, supposedly the most sacred union, could be twisted into a public spectacle of power. Royal wedding nights were sometimes staged for the court to witness, not in full exposure, but with enough hints and symbolic gestures to make the point. The union was not merely between two people, but a demonstration of dominance by the ruling family over their subjects. Behind the closed doors that followed, the consummation could be far from mutual, and in some cases, far from human decency. The medieval palace, with its grand halls and glittering banquets, may seem like a place of refinement and culture. But for those trapped within its most secret corridors, it could be a gilded prison, one where the price of survival was submission to the darkest desires of the crown. While Western Europe's monarchies indulged in their own brand of decadent secrecy, the courts of Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire cultivated practices just as disturbing, though often masked under layers of religious ritual and imperial grandeur. In Constantinople, the Byzantine emperors inherited not only the political legacy of Rome, but also its appetite for absolute control over the bodies of those in their orbit. Imperial concubines were carefully selected, often from distant lands, to ensure they had no local family ties that could interfere with their loyalty. Once inside the palace, these women lived in the gyneceum, an elaborate complex guarded day and night by eunuchs, men surgically altered to remove any possibility of sexual competition. The eunuchs themselves were often victims of a horrific system, boys captured from enemy territories, castrated before puberty, and trained for a lifetime of servitude. These concubines were expected to master court etiquette, music, and the art of conversation, but their primary purpose was to serve the emperor's pleasure. They were paraded during feasts like rare jewels, adorned in gold-threaded gowns, then withdrawn into private quarters for selection. The most favored could wield immense power behind the scenes, influencing imperial decrees and appointments, but the position was never safe. A concubine who fell from favor might be sent to a remote monastery for life, or quietly poisoned to ensure her silence. In the Slavic royal courts, particularly in Kiev and Rus, rulers often practiced bride kidnapping, not as a romantic gesture, but as a politically sanctioned act of domination. Chronicles describe young women of noble birth being abducted during raids or political negotiations, forcibly married and expected to bear heirs to cement alliances. Refusal was unthinkable. In such cases, accidents tended to happen before the wedding could even take place. Even more disturbing were the trial nights in certain Balkan courts, where virgin brides were inspected not by their husbands, but by older female relatives or trusted court officials to ensure their purity before the marriage was publicly confirmed. These inspections were not medical in nature but invasive rituals that served as a public humiliation. If a bride failed to meet the expectations of the royal family, she could be sent away in disgrace, her family's reputation ruined. Back in Western Europe, similar practices flourished under different names. The so-called droit du seigneur, the alleged right of the Lord to sleep with a vassal-s bride on her wedding night, remains a debated historical concept. While many historians argue it was more myth than fact, there are enough whispered accounts in medieval letters and court records to suggest that, in some cases, it was indeed enforced, especially among particularly arrogant or cruel rulers, whether real or symbolic. The fear of such a violation reinforced the power of the monarch and reminded subjects that their bodies ultimately belonged to the crown. Religious hypocrisy was another key feature of these practices. Monarchs would sponsor lavish church processions, endow monasteries with land, and publicly confess their sins, only to return to the palace and engage in acts that violated the very moral codes they claimed to uphold. Priests and confessors who knew too much were often rewarded with wealth and protection, ensuring their silence. Perhaps the most grotesque of all were the holy unions, orchestrated by some rulers, marriages or liaisons justified as divine will. In these cases, spiritual visions, dreams, or prophecies were used as excuses to pursue partners well outside the bounds of normal morality, sometimes even involving close relatives. For the common people, questioning such a union was tantamount to blasphemy. For the ruler, it was yet another tool to blur the lines between sacred duty and personal indulgence. Behind the gold leaf, jeweled crowns, and solemn oaths, the reality of medieval royalty was far from noble. It was a world where faith, law, and tradition could be twisted into weapons of control, and where those trapped inside the palace walls had little choice but to endure, hope, or plot their escape. If the public could have seen what went on behind the closed doors of royal bedchambers, medieval monarchies might have collapsed overnight. But secrecy was everything, and every court had its own methods for ensuring silence. In England, France, and parts of Italy, some kings kept pleasure rooms, private, hidden chambers within their castles designed solely for sexual indulgence. These were not just lavish bedrooms. They were elaborate fantasy spaces decorated with silks, mirrors, and imported perfumes, where rulers staged elaborate erotic performances. In certain cases, these sessions weren't private at all. Select courtiers, entertainers, or even foreign envoys might be invited to watch as a sign of dominance. A grotesque demonstration of the monarch's absolute control over bodies and morality. In royal chronicles, such rooms were sometimes referred to in coded language: the gold chamber, the summer salon, the music gallery, phrases that sounded harmless but hinted at their real purpose. Any servant or guard who was admitted into these spaces was bound by terrifying oaths of secrecy, often backed by threats of torture or execution. One of the darkest aspects of medieval royal sexuality was the use of children as pawns in political games. Betrothals between kings and young brides were commonplace, with girls sometimes as young as 10 or 12 brought to court to learn how to please their future husbands. They might be raised in the palace for years before the marriage was consummated, but they lived under constant scrutiny, molded into the ideal of a submissive, obedient consort. The power imbalance was absolute, and in many cases, the royal husband didn't wait until the official wedding to take what he wanted. Meanwhile, the church, the supposed moral authority of the era, was often complicit. Bishops might grant special dispensations to allow incestuous marriages for the sake of the realm, or turn a blind eye to relationships that blatantly violated canon law. Royal confessions were treated as matters of state secrecy, sealed away in church archives never meant to be opened. In Spain and Portugal, the Reconquista period brought its own blend of brutality and sexual exploitation. Royal captives taken from enemy courts, especially during wars with Muslim states, were sometimes paraded naked before the court as a form of humiliation. The monarch might then claim the most beautiful as a concubine, framing it as an act of divine conquest. These women were not simply lovers. They were trophies, symbols of military and religious victory, and their personal consent was irrelevant. In many royal households, there was also a belief that a ruler's sexual vigor was directly linked to the strength of the kingdom. If the king appeared weak, ill, or uninterested in physical pleasure, rumors of impending disaster would spread. To combat this, some rulers engaged in public displays of virility, bedding multiple partners in a single night, fathering illegitimate children across the realm, or boasting of their prowess to foreign ambassadors. These acts were political theater, staged as much for the morale of the court as for personal satisfaction. But such excesses had consequences. Jealousy within the harem or royal court could be deadly. Rivals might poison a favorite concubine, spread rumors to ruin a queen's reputation, or manipulate the ruler's affections for their own political gain. Sometimes, the victims of these power struggles were accused of witchcraft or treason, giving the crown a convenient excuse to dispose of them publicly. The real horror was that none of this was exceptional. These practices weren't isolated scandals. They were woven into the very structure of monarchy. From England to the Byzantine Empire, from Spain to Russia, sexual exploitation was not only tolerated but institutionalized, protected by the very systems meant to uphold justice. And the victims, stripped of power and voice, could only watch as history was written to erase their suffering. In the courts of medieval Europe, sex was not just an indulgence, it was a weapon. Kings, queens, and high-ranking nobles often used intimate acts as tools for manipulation, blackmail, and even statecraft. And in this high-stakes game, no one was safe, not even members of the royal family themselves. Some rulers turned their own siblings into bargaining chips. In France, for instance, a king might force his sister into marriage with an older, lecherous foreign duke in exchange for an alliance. But marriage was just the beginning. In certain cases, the new husband would be encouraged or even commanded to share his bride with her royal brother during diplomatic visits, as a way to bind the families together. This practice was whispered about, but rarely written down, and when it was, chroniclers used veiled language to hide the truth. In other kingdoms, sexual humiliation was a deliberate tactic to destroy political enemies. A disgraced nobleman's wife or daughter could be summoned to the royal bedchamber, publicly declared the king's gift, and then paraded in front of courtiers afterward. Such actions sent a chilling message. The king had the right to take whatever and whoever he pleased. Medieval queens, too, could be both victims and perpetrators. While most had little personal freedom, some learned to exploit the very systems designed to control them. In certain courts, a queen might keep her own network of lovers, usually younger knights or trusted courtiers. But unlike a king, she could never flaunt these relationships without risk. Discovery meant public disgrace, imprisonment, or execution, unless she was powerful enough to eliminate anyone who threatened her secrets. Some of the most disturbing royal sexual practices involved enforced voyeurism. In parts of Italy and the Holy Roman Empire, certain rulers forced guests or political rivals to witness their intimate acts as a show of power. This wasn't about pleasure, it was about dominance, humiliation, and reminding everyone in the room that the ruler owned not just their land, but their dignity. Then there were the tests of virginity, a particularly invasive and humiliating tradition that was often applied to young brides of kings. Before a royal wedding could be consummated, the bride might be examined by court-appointed matrons or even the ruler himself to prove her purity. In some cases, this inspection was witnessed by multiple members of the court, turning the private moment into a spectacle of degradation. For many young women, this was their first experience of royal life, and it set the tone for the years of control and objectification that would follow. In certain Eastern European courts, sexual training of royal brides was not left to chance. Historical whispers suggest that some kings employed older, experienced women or male courtiers to prepare a future queen before the wedding night, claiming it would ensure a smooth consummation. Official records never detail these events, but the accounts survive in personal letters, gossip from ambassadors, and scandalous poems of the era. The most chilling part of these stories is how normalized they were. Within the walls of a medieval palace, sexual exploitation was not a hidden shame, but an accepted facet of royal culture. It was protected by laws, enforced by loyal courtiers, and cloaked in the language of duty, alliance, and tradition. To challenge it was to challenge the crown itself, and few dared to try. As we move deeper into the shadows of medieval royalty, the veil over these practices grows thinner and the darkness more unsettling. One of the most disturbing elements of royal sexual culture was the use of youth as status symbols. In certain courts, having the youngest, most beautiful companions was not just a matter of personal taste, it was a political display. A way to show wealth, influence, and control. Kings and queens competed to surround themselves with individuals whose beauty and youth were so striking they became conversation pieces in foreign courts. But behind this public glamour lay a far more sinister reality. Many of these companions were brought into royal households as children, groomed and educated to please their sovereign in ways that went far beyond courtly manners. The process could last years, ensuring that by the time they reached adolescence, they were entirely dependent on and loyal to the ruler who had shaped them. Royal harems in certain medieval kingdoms operated with similar intent. While most people associate harems with the Islamic world, various European rulers adopted their own versions, collections of favored lovers kept in secluded areas of the palace. In Spain, France, and even parts of the Holy Roman Empire, kings and high nobles maintained private quarters where no outsider could enter without special permission. Here, the ruler's power was absolute, and the people within were little more than possessions. The secrecy of these quarters fueled endless rumors. Diplomats from rival kingdoms would report back with tales of orgies, competitions for favor, and even cruel punishments for those who displeased the ruler. Some chroniclers describe elaborate masquerade nights, where guests were required to wear masks and robes and nothing else, before engaging in courtly games that often turned violent. And yet, these practices were not always confined to men. A few powerful queens, especially those who ruled in their own right, established their own circles of young and attractive companions. While this was far rarer and far more dangerous for women in power, it did happen, and when it did, it sparked scandal and sometimes political crises. Rivals would seize on any hint of impropriety to undermine a queen's authority, painting her as morally unfit to rule. Another horrific but less discussed element was the use of sexual rituals as proof of loyalty. Some rulers demanded that new courtiers, guards, or servants submit to sexual tests to prove their obedience. These could be disguised as harmless ceremonies, a night of service, or a feast of the senses, but their true purpose was to humiliate and bind the participant to the ruler through shared secrets and shame. For those who refused, the consequences could be devastating. Refusal was seen as an act of defiance, often resulting in exile, loss of property, or even execution. For those who complied, there was no escape. The ruler held their reputation hostage forever. What makes all of this even more chilling is how carefully it was hidden from official history. Court historians rarely mentioned such matters, and when they did, they buried them in coded language, euphemisms, or moral warnings about the dangers of vice. But the gossip of servants, the letters of ambassadors, and the scandal sheets passed among the nobility keep these stories alive, stories that, for centuries, those in power tried desperately to erase. By now, you've seen just how depraved and calculated the sexual practices of medieval royalty could be, but the final layer is perhaps the most horrifying of all, the deliberate weaponization of intimacy. In some courts, sex was not just a private indulgence or scandalous entertainment. It was a political tool, sharpened like a blade and used to control enemies, allies, and even entire kingdoms. Rulers understood that nothing could destroy a person faster than public humiliation over their most private moments, and they exploited that truth without mercy. One of the most notorious strategies involved entrapment. A royal might arrange for a political rival to be seduced, sometimes by the ruler themselves, sometimes by a trusted agent, in a setting where witnesses were conveniently accidentally present. Once the act was seen, the victim was no longer free. They could be blackmailed into supporting royal policies, surrendering land, or abandoning claims to power. In other cases, rulers staged ritualized displays of dominance during feasts or ceremonies, forcing courtiers to perform or submit in ways that blurred the line between entertainment and abuse. Chroniclers wrote in veiled terms about banquets of shame, where guests, stripped of their dignity and sometimes their clothing, were commanded to act out erotic scenes for the amusement of the court, the most chilling part. In many instances, these events were meticulously documented, not in official state records, of course, but in secret archives kept by the monarch. Paintings, coded diaries, and even physical tokens were stored away as proof, ready to be used if a participant ever posed a threat. Royal mistresses and favorites often found themselves caught in this web. While some wielded great influence through their closeness to the ruler, their position was always precarious. If they fell out of favor, they could be accused of witchcraft, treason, or moral corruption, charges that could lead to imprisonment, torture, or execution. The very intimacy that had elevated them became the weapon that destroyed them. And when death came, it often brought erasure. Records were burned, portraits defaced, and names removed from chronicles. Successors wanted no trace of these scandals to linger, and yet, fragments of truth survived in whispered rumors, forbidden poems, and the coded writings of those brave enough to defy royal censorship. In the end, what makes these stories so haunting is not just their cruelty or perversity, but their deliberate concealment. These weren't the wild excesses of ordinary people. They were calculated acts committed by the most powerful individuals of the age, wrapped in a cloak of sanctity, honor, and divine right. And now, centuries later, the truth is clawing its way back into the light, piece by piece, story by story. Because no matter how hard history tries to erase the sins of the crowned and anointed, the shadows always remember.